December 2nd, we will host a breaking news town hall on what the Constitution says about impeachment. And we will bring together a range of legislators and scholars to discuss the history and constitutional dimensions of the impeachment process. On December 5th, we have the Federal Judicial Center on the Fourth Amendment and privacy, historical perspectives. And December 6th should be a really moving program. It's called The Girl in the Picture, Remembering Vietnam. And it will include the heroic human rights activist Kim Phuc, who as a child was immortalized in the infamous Napalm Girl photo. Remember her running down the street? And she'll be with Mark Bowden, the Atlantic journalist on Vietnam, and the prophet and composer Hannibal Lecumbe, who's written an oratorio paying tribute to Kim Phuc, and I think it should be an extraordinary evening. All right, and now we're going to start a very special program. We're going to begin by discussing the extremely important new book by Lawrence Lessig, They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy. Larry Lessig is one of America's most important constitutional theorists. He has a new book out on how to interpret the Constitution, and at the same time he has published this culmination and refinement of his thoughts about constitutional reform that bring them together in a galvanizing and important way. This is the first stop on his book tour, and I'm so honored that he will be here with us at the Constitution Center. Please join me in welcoming Larry Lessig. And after Larry and I talk a bit about his great new book, I will bring in two very distinguished interlocutors to join us on the question of whether we need a constitutional convention to achieve the reforms that he and they urge. And each of them is an American leader for a different reform. Howie Rich is the chairman of the organization U.S. Term Limits, which works to establish and defend term limits at all levels of government. And he has some very powerful ideas about term limits and a convention. And then Daniel Epps has just written the very powerful article about how to change the composition of the Supreme Court that Pete Buttigieg cited in the last presidential debate. Daniel Epps is an associate professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis, and his most recent article, How to Save the Supreme Court, co-written with Ganesh Sitaraman and published in the Yale Law Journal, as I say, has been getting widespread attention. Please join me in welcoming Howie Rich and Daniel Epps. Okay, Larry, I'm so honored that you're here with us to talk about the book, and one of the many striking notions that you begin with was with an apology. You say that you've been talking a lot about the importance of campaign finance reform, but have come to realize that's just one part of a larger problem of an unrepresentative America. Tell us what you mean about how America and the American Constitution is unrepresentative.
Well, I think actually the important confession is that I don't feel I've been disciplined enough to talk about this in a way that could actually bring all Americans into the conversation. You know, we liberals find it very easy to talk about our issues in a self-righteous and convinced way, in a way that speaks primarily and maybe exclusively to liberals. And so talking about the money in politics part triggers, for many people, a signal. Are you a liberal or not a liberal? Even though there are many great conservatives who also are concerned about money in politics, it's a dividing discourse as opposed to a uniting discourse. And so when I wrote this book, I thought, look, I actually believe that the kind of enthusiasm you demonstrated, you said this was your
congregation.
Yeah,
is the word
this is your congregation, and you demonstrated the congregation.
That's the highest compliment.
When you got so excited about the idea that this is a nonpartisan effort. And I think this is extremely important. The book ends with these stories of these incredible reform efforts led by people who have a single central rule, that politics, partisan politics, is not allowed to be part of the conversation. So this extraordinary woman, Katie Fahey, who, a 20-something, put a Facebook post up and said, is anybody interested in working on gerrymandering in Michigan. And within a couple months had 4,000 volunteers, and within a couple months after that had collected 400,000 signatures to get a ballot measure on the Michigan ballot to end partisan gerrymandering. And in that effort, she had a discipline that said, never can you say Democrat or Republican. That we have to inspire people to want to be part of this movement as citizens first, because we are citizens first, and we all embrace that somewhere, and there's such a deep desire that we should be able to talk about politics without the hate and the division which defines politics right now. So that was the motivation to write this book. And what I realized as I thought about what I really was upset about when I talked about money in politics is that it is an example, one example, of the way that we've allowed our representative democracy to become unrepresentative. You know, many conservatives will tell you, look, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. But of course, by a republic, the framers meant a representative democracy. And it's kind of built into the title. The thing about a representative democracy is it's supposed to be representative. It's supposed to allow all of us to feel like we all have the same political power inside of the system. That the fact that you're white doesn't mean you have more power than black or men than women, or that you live in Kansas versus Texas, but that we've allowed the system of our democracy to evolve so that we, on many dimensions, don't have equality in our system. So money in politics is the most obvious. You know, members of Congress, candidates for Congress, spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to fund their campaigns. But they're not raising money from the average person. They're not just randomly dialing numbers on their telephone. They're raising money from the tiniest fraction of the 1%. So that 150,000 Americans have enormous influence relative to the rest of America. That's the obvious, that's the one that we liberals really like to focus on. But, you know, gerrymandering is a way of rendering us unequal in the way that we exist in the elections of our members of Congress. You know, that Congress is divided into districts which states draw with the objective to create safe seats in their district. So if you're in a safe seat Republican district, you know if you're the Republican representative, you're not going to be beaten by a Democrat. And if you're a safe seat Democratic district, you know if you're a representative, you're not going to be beaten by a Republican. But you're not worried about a party from the other side. You are worried about somebody from your own party. You could be beaten by somebody in your primary. But what we know about primaries is the people who win primaries are even more extreme versions of the people they are challenging. So if you're a Republican, what you're worried about is an even more right-wing Republican. If you're a Democrat, what you're worried about is an even more left-wing Democrat. Which means in these districts, 85% of Congress is safe seat districts. In these districts, what they're doing is constantly focusing to their extremes, which means the extremists have enormous influence over our Congress way beyond their numbers, way beyond what they're entitled to if you just think about making everybody representative. Or think about the Electoral College. We have this impression that the United States of America elects our president. That's not true. We have delegated the election of our president to a country called Swing State America. Swing State America, the 14 or so states, you know, like Pennsylvania, which is close enough to go either way, is the place that selects our president. In 2016, 99% of campaign spending was in 14 states. 99%. Which means these are the only states that the president cares about, and there's all sorts of empirical data to show spending and regulatory policy bends to make swing staters happy. You might not feel happy, but you're happier than a lot of people out there because you really matter. Now, the New Jersey people, they don't matter at all, right? So, I mean, like, look at this administration. When Trump came to office, he immediately ended the offshore drilling ban. Almost overnight, Florida got an exemption from that. New Jersey can't even get a hearing because who cares about New Jersey? New Jersey is a solidly blue state. It never is going to matter to a presidential election, but Florida, like Pennsylvania, is a critical swing state. But the thing about swing states is they don't represent America. I mean, you know, you're decent citizens. I come from Pennsylvania. I'm a Williams Porter from Pennsylvania. But Swing staters in general don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industry is not the cutting-edge industry of America. So I think you should be represented just like anybody else should be represented, but you shouldn't be represented more. So this, and then the way we suppress votes, the point is add these all together. And what this means is that on any number of dimensions, we've built a representative democracy that does not represent us. Sometimes it benefits the rich, money in politics. Sometimes it benefits the extremists, gerrymandering. Sometimes it benefits these swing staters, the Electoral College. Sometimes it benefits the party in power who's suppressing the vote of the party out of power, whether Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't matter which of these dimensions. The point is the core promise of a representative democracy, that we are equally represented, has been defeated in our democracy. And that's the core reform we've got to find a way to implement.
Such a powerful analysis. It is powerfully bipartisan, as you say, or nonpartisan. Your constitutional theory book talks a lot about translating the values of the framers in light of new understandings and changes in society. To what degree did the framers anticipate an unrepresentative democracy, and to what degree is our current unrepresentative democracy a violation of the hopes of the framers? And maybe start with the Senate, which has changed over time, but you argued it was not what they expected.
Right. Well, so, the Senate was a great compromise, especially for Madison, as you know, but also Wilson, looked at the Senate as a terrible, terrible compromise. Madison, for a while, said he was just not even going to agree to the Constitution, which he had helped birth because of this insistence that there be equal representation for the states in the Senate. Because he thought it didn't make sense to have a representative democracy with a branch that was essentially unrepresentative. But many people thought of that branch not as representing the people, but as representing states. And this was a moment in our constitutional history where the idea of mixed representative governments was familiar, like the British model, where you had the Crown and the Lords and the Commons, each representing a different part of British society in one. And many people thought of our Constitution in the same way. Not that the Senate was representing the aristocracy, but the Senate was representing states, and the House was representing the people, and the President, in some sense, representing everybody. So the Senate was a compromise. But I think the challenge for us is to figure out what we understand the Senate to be today. Because as much as they took seriously the Senate as representing states, and they made senators appointed by state legislatures, we don't have senators appointed by state legislatures anymore. They're appointed by us through elections. And the gap between big states and small states is humongous compared to that. Then, the difference between Delaware and Pennsylvania was like 17-1. Now the difference between California and Wyoming is something like 70-1. So the unrepresentativeness caused by the Senate is massive and huge. And so I, in this book, acknowledge that if you think that representative government in both branches is about representing people, we've got a real compromise in the context of the Senate. But the challenge with the Senate is that the Constitution explicitly makes it unamendable that there would be 2 senators from every state. It's the one part of the Constitution, there's 2 things in Article 5 of the Constitution that are said to be unamendable. One of them was the clause that protected slave trade until 1808, and the other was the clause that requires equal representation in the Senate. Neither of those 2 things can be changed without changing Article 5. So in my book, what I'm saying is we're kind of stuck with this one, but what can we do to change the way the Senate works, to try to get it as close to representative as we can? And my own sense is, like, if we can solve all of these other problems, this is a relatively small problem that would be remaining in this unrepresentative representative democracy.
So part of this powerful book argues that our institutions are failing because in ways that the framers did not anticipate, they are failing to represent the considered and thoughtful views of the moderate majority of the American people, and instead have been polarized and made more extreme by these institutional failures. But you're also critical of we the people for failing to educate ourselves about important constitutional issues and to perform the duty, as you call it, of citizen in the way that the framers anticipated. And you have all sorts of explanations for that, including our fractured media landscape. But tell us about how we the citizens are failing our constitutional values.
Well, I mean, the congregation of the National Constitution Center probably doesn't recognize this, but
No,
not everybody is as focused on these issues as you might be. And part of the reason this is such a problem is a kind of unappreciated coincidence that happened in the 20th century. So the familiar thing about the 20th century was the explosion of broadcasting. And we had this period of time which people like Marcus Pryor from Princeton refer to as the period of broadcast democracy, when America is focused, all of us, on essentially the same sources every single day. Like television is on at the same time every day. It's the news. The news is delivered to us in a relatively down the road, middle of the road way. You can't help but be exposed to it. And what you're being exposed to is essentially the same story. And that period from 1950 to 1985, for us, defines our conception of what American democracy is. But the second thing that happened during this period that we don't think about a lot is that this is the birth of polling, too. Polling really captures the national imagination with the election of FDR in 1936, where the then dominant straw poll technology had said that Alf Landon was going to beat FDR, and George Gallup said, no, I can talk to 1,000 people and I can tell you not only will Alf Landon lose and lose by a lot, but I'll tell you exactly about how much he's going to lose. And everybody laughed at George Gallup, but of course, when Roosevelt won the largest majority in any contested election in the history of presidential elections, people were convinced there was something to this technology. And that gave birth to a technology where we can actually hear, like the people were legible. We knew what they thought. And when those two things grew up together during broadcast democracy, we could watch the people progress on many important issues, whether it's civil rights, which obviously is driven dramatically by television, confronting people with the reality of the horrors that are going on in the South, and we evolve in response to that, or Vietnam, or the impeachment of Richard Nixon, or the environment. These are all issues where we grow up, and we can see us growing up because we can poll. All right, we've now left broadcast democracy. We, in some ways, have gone back to the 19th century. We live in a world where media is partisan and fragmented, and we all live in our own little bubbles. And the consequence of that is profound when we think about critical national issues that we as a nation need to address, like impeachment. The striking thing about the impeachment of Richard Nixon is, if you look at the polls and the views of Republicans and Democrats, of course, Republicans like Nixon more than Democrats. But the support for Nixon is almost perfectly correlated between Republicans and Democrats. Like, they like him at a certain point, and then exactly at the same moment, everybody starts not liking Nixon. And that's because we're all watching the same news. And it's the same story. And you might have a different reaction if you're a conservative Republican, if you're a liberal Democrat, but the point is, the facts are the facts, and you begin to bend to the facts. And Nixon goes from 88% or 85% support among Republicans 6 months before he resigns to 50% support among Republicans, and that's when those Senate Republicans walked over to the White House and said, you need to resign. In this environment, that's not the reality. In this environment, we watch our shows, they watch their shows. And regardless of what happens, we're going to come out of this, some of us thinking, I can't believe this is what happened, and the other part of us thinking, I can't believe anybody didn't know that this was going to happen, right? Regardless of what happens, we're going to have people who don't even understand the other side. And this is the part that I ask people, can you explain to me why that person disagrees with you? And it's not just that we know that he disagrees with you, it's just you don't even know why he disagrees with you. And this is because we've built this environment these media environment where we live in these separate universes. Barack Obama, about 2 months ago, said, if you watch Fox News, you live in a different reality from if you read the New York Times. Well, when you live in a democracy, which has got to address the same issues together, what happens when we all are living in a different reality? Now, but here's where the important connection to polling comes in. In some sense, this was true for the whole of human history except this broadcast democracy period. You know, in the 19th century, people also lived in their own realities. The North and South lived in their own realities. That's what, in some sense, led to the Civil War. But the difference now is that we can actually see how different we are. And we actually reinforce our views on the basis of our different realities. So the legibility of us means that the kind of craziness of our current views is transparent to everybody. And I worry that we begin to lose confidence in the very idea of democracy the more we see just how crazy we are. Now, of course, we're not going to go back to the 1970s. I don't want to go back to the 1970s. But I do think we need to think about how do you build a democracy in a world where you know we're all going to be living in these different realities. That's just the reality. So how do we knit together an understanding on top of that reality that can begin to be something that represents America in a way that makes us confident and hopeful about what it could do?
Well, let's talk about how you think we can build that America, and we'll talk about the particular reforms you propose and whether a constitutional convention is necessary. But first, let's talk about your provocative suggestion that we need civic juries and that properly formulated deliberation modeled on that in the Constitutional Convention itself would slow down deliberation, introduce citizens to diverse viewpoints, and lead to more reasoned outcomes that might inform, even if they didn't determine, policy outcomes.
Yeah, so I had this weird experience of traveling to Mongolia in May of 2017 and observing the very first Mongolian deliberative poll about a Mongolian constitutional amendment. Because for bizarre reasons, Mongolia has a law that says the parliament is not allowed to consider an amendment to the Constitution until they run what's called a deliberative poll. Now, a deliberative poll is a random representative selection of the population. So there were 700 Mongolians in the Mongolian parliament, but a perfect representative picture of Mongolia. So just the right of number of people from the city, Ulaanbaatar, right number from the rural areas. Half those people had been on buses for 2 nights to come to that city. Half of them men, half of them women, rich, poor, professional, not. Like they'd figured the demographics. They'd gotten basically a summons that said, you have to show up, like jury duty, and participate in this process. Now, I went to it, as a constitutional law professor with all sorts of arrogance about how they're never going to be able to figure these issues out. This is too complicated. It takes real training from real professors to be able to understand these issues. And I was blown away listening to the conversation through a translator over the course of the 3 days as these people grappled and understood and came to an extremely sophisticated view about this question. And that made me take seriously something which I'd read about and I'd seen in a lot of different contexts, but I really began to believe in at that moment, about how we can begin to construct visions of ourselves, or institutions that represent us, that can begin to speak in a way that we would respect, like a kind of we that we would be proud of. And it's kind of modeled on a jury in the sense that it's a small set of us, but it's much better than a jury because it's a representative set of us. It's like random representative selection, drafted to come together and deliberate after being given information and going through a process to understand the issue and progress on it. And so what I argue in this book, 2 of my earlier books have had whole chapters arguing in favor of Article 5 conventions. But what I argue in this book is I still believe in an Article 5 convention. I'm getting a lot of trouble from my liberal friends for doing that, but that's my view and I'm going to stick to it. But I think at the very least, all of us should be able to agree that we should create a shadow process to an Article 5 convention. So let's say we had a law that said, if 20 states call for an Article 5 convention on any subject, balanced budget, term limits, campaign finance, whatever, then Congress will convene, let's say, 5 deliberative polls on that issue. 5 polls where you select 500 Americans, randomly representative, bring them together, give them issues on both sides. We could probably hold it here. It's not quite big enough, but you get,
We could, indeed.
yeah.
In fact, there's no better place to hold it.
I agree. That's why I'm pitching this right now
Well,
to you, with your
Sold.
congregation.
Absolutely. All we need is the money, and we'll do it tomorrow.
And so you give them both sides of the issue. You poll their views at the beginning. You poll their views at the end. And what you see from that is what Americans, reflective in the best moment, think about this particular issue. You see us, in some sense, in our best. And when you think about it like that, the Republican tradition, small r Republican tradition, says citizens are a public office. But we are the only public officers who get to be quizzed, right? Like the President of the United States, before this President, the President of the United States is not somebody who blathered, right? The President was somebody who, you ask the President a question, the President answers that question on the basis of information that's been given to, so far, just him, that's based on lots of really smart insights by everybody, and he's reflected on it. He's come to a view. If you walked up to Elena Kagan on the streets of Washington and you asked her a question about admiralty law, she'd be perfectly within her rights to say, hey, I don't answer quiz questions about admiralty law. You have a question about admiralty law? Get a case. Get some briefs. Get to the Supreme Court. Give us a chance to have an oral argument. Then we'll reflect on it, and then we'll give you our view. Or even a jury. If you have a jury listening to a case, you can't just walk into the jury room midway through and take a poll and say, what do you think? Is he guilty or not? The jury is a process for coming to a view, and it's only at the end of that process that they get to speak. But we, the people, we get quizzed. You're making dinner, the telephone rings, you pick it up, somebody says, what do you think of NAFTA? Or should we have thorium reactors? And you don't know anything about those questions. You've not thought about it. You don't have a chance to reflect. You have no staff. But you're asked to give your view, and then your view is represented. And then it's like, look how stupid people are. Well, what do you expect? Even Elena Kagan would be stupid if she didn't get a chance to read her briefs or to have a sense to reflect and to think about it. And so one part of this is just, why do we accept the indignity of we the people being represented in the most stupid and ridiculous way possible, consistently and repeatedly? Why don't we insist on a process that at least allows us to be the best that we can? Because I am really convinced. Many people look at the problem of democracy and they say, let's get rid of democracy. Let's create technocracy, or let's create elites who get to rule. I'm totally against that. I deeply believe in democracy. But I believe in a democracy where the people actually have a chance to know something and reflect on it and give their view in an informed and balanced way. And we could build that if we just committed to building that.
You're so profoundly right that none of us can have an informed opinion, even about topics we're supposed to know something about, unless we've heard the best arguments on both sides. One of the greatest privileges I have in this amazing job at the Constitution Center is hosting the We the People podcast, where every week I call up the top liberal and conservative scholars about the constitutional issue of the week. And friends, I cannot have an informed opinion about any of these issues, from is the president's decision to rescind the Dreamers Act constitutional to can the president build a wall, until I've heard the arguments on both sides and have been educated about it. And this is my job to know about these questions. How could we expect citizens to have an informed opinion without being similarly educated? And that's why I'm excited to work with you and with you, friends here, and dear C-SPAN viewers, if you want to support the idea of citizen polls here at the Constitution. No, it's jrosen@constitutioncenter.org, and if we can fund it, we'll do it. But I want to ask you one last question and then bring in our friends. If you could have an Article 5 convention, what reforms would you propose to it? You end the book by endorsing the bill that Representative Pelosi introduced, arguing for public funding for congressional election, the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, automatic voting registration, gerrymandering reform. Those are unlikely to pass Congress. Would you put those reforms to an Article 5 convention? What other reforms would you put? And why do you still believe that an Article 5 convention is advisable?
Well, I'm somebody who believes that we've got to amend our Constitution. And I'm realistic enough to know our Congress is not going to propose those amendments, right? I mean, I'm all for those people on my side running out trying to get people to sign up for petitions to get Congress to propose an amendment to overturn Citizens United. There's precisely zero chance, in my view, that the United States Senate is going to, by a 2/3 majority, propose an amendment to overturn Citizens United. It's just not going to happen. I mean, maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. It's just not going to happen. So the framers actually gave us a way around Congress. That's the Article 5 Convention. Indeed, when the amendment provision was proposed, it originally didn't include anything other than Congress proposing the amendment. And George Mason, just before the end of the convention, stood up and said, wait a minute, what if Congress is the problem? And it was a kind of duh moment. Yeah, of course, we need a way to amend the Constitution if Congress is the problem. And that's who the problem is. It is Congress. We have a failed branch in our government. I mean, the president is the president, and the courts are extraordinary compared to what the framers thought. The branch that has failed is Congress. So we have to find a way to fix Congress. The only way they give it us is an Article 5 convention, and I think we should try to use it for that purpose. So my amendments, it's just a simple principle. It doesn't have to be terribly long, but it's a principle that in some sense was already there, but obviously needs surfaced. It's a principle of political equality. Racial equality was an important part of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. It took us 100 years to actually begin to deliver on that. Sex equality through the 19th Amendment and maybe the 28th Amendment, we'll see, is an important fight. Those are all important equalities. Income equality is a hugely important. But we at least ought to be able to agree on this first equality, political equality. So my amendment would do what the Constitution doesn't do, give everybody a right to vote, which is not actually guaranteed in our Constitution. And it would compel institutions to establish this principle of political equality, which would write against gerrymandering. It would direct that we have congressmen who can be elected without being dependent on this tiny fraction of funders. It would empower Congress to make sure that states don't rig the system against the party that's out of power. But it would be an organizing principle for this ideal that ought to, in some sense, be something we can all agree on. Like, who really would stand up and say, no, I deserve more power than you do? I think in some sense we all should be able to agree that all of us as citizens equally should have the same political power inside of representative democracy.
Thank you so much for that and for this inspiring call to constitutional reform. Howie Rich, you are the leader of the leading organization arguing for term limits reform. You argued an important case before the Supreme Court, and you are in favor of an Article 5 convention to achieve term limits. Tell us why and how you would ensure that the convention would focus on term limits and not on other issues that you might not favor.
Okay, initially what we did in our strategy to get term limits is we had a strategy in which voters could vote for a term limits amendment to their own state constitution. We got 23 states to do it, tough campaigns and all the rest of it, and a U.S. Supreme Court case, our case, U.S. term limits versus Thornton. We lost that case 5-4 in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1995. Our new strategy is utilizing Article 5, the second method for a convention. And term limits, in my view, really, it would be very helpful in terms of the democratic process. We have term limits on 15 state legislatures. And what we've seen is more women, competitive elections, money is more equalized. This is stuff that you, Larry, you're interested in accomplishing. And Congress is just, it's unbelievable. Congress, Ballotpedia did a a study on how many competitive elections were there in 2016. There were 435 House seats, 23 were competitive. That means 6% of seats were competitive. The incumbent wins all the rest of them. Come 2018, where we had a wave election, 82 seats were considered competitive by Ballotpedia. 20%. What about the others? In 40 districts, nobody challenges the incumbent. So what you get is a political class and a seniority system. So we're utilizing this Article 5 route, the second method that George Mason suggested. And the main reason that I favor term limits, and the term limit I favor is a real term limit, 3 House terms, 6 years, and 2 Senate terms, is what we call adverse pre-selection. There are a lot of people in this room who I think would qualify for Congress. And if you think about it, you say, oh, somebody asked me to run for Congress. Great. Let me take a look at it. The re-election rate in the U.S. House of Representatives is 95%. So if you are foolish enough to run for Congress against an incumbent, not much of a chance. But in this particular district, we have a chance because the incumbent was indicted, or it's an open seat. You know, he left, he retired, okay, for whatever reason. Great, I think I'll run. But you think about it some more. Let's suppose I'm a doctor, I'm an accountant, I'm an engineer, I'm a business person, I'm an educator. If I win, I run, win, they go through all this scrutiny, and now I win. And now I have a chance to be I'm going to get in Congress. How does it work? Well, there's a seniority system. It's a top-down system. I'm a successful, engineer or whatever I'm in life. I'm going to be subservient to seniority. The average committee chair has been in Congress for 23 years. So if I'm going to run, I'm not saying me, but a successful person in life wants to run, why would I run? I'm going to be subservient. It's going to take me a decade or 2 decades to get anything accomplished. Why would I do that? We call this adverse pre-selection because the best people, on average, don't run. But then there's this idea of term limits on Congress. And if you had 3 House terms, the seniority system is out the window. It's now based on merit. You're going to attract more people. You're going to have competitive elections. Money will be equalized. You know, money works like this, Larry, you understand this. It's something like the incumbent raises and spends $1.5 million, the challenger $250,000. So it's a 6-to-1 advantage to the incumbent. And of course, the incumbent has all the name ID to start with. Special interest PACs, $9 to $1. So it's a rigged system. But in open seats, where you don't have this, disparity between a challenger and an incumbent, the average is $600,000. So what term limits does, real term limits, it equalizes the system. And the Article 5 approach, to me, I agree with Larry, it's the only way to do it. You're going to get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to term limit themselves without enormous pressure. Give me a break.
Thank you very much for that. Daniel Epps, you've just written this runaway success article in terms of the attention it's been getting. How to Save the Supreme Court is the summary of it in Vox, but all of you should read the original in the Yale Law Journal. And there are 2 big proposals that you make, and I'll just summarize them quickly because I want to ask you about the convention route. First, there's the Supreme Court lottery. Under this reform, every judge on the Federal Court of Appeals would be appointed as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would hear cases of a panel of 9 randomly selected from all the justices. And then you say that by law, each panel would be prohibited from having more than 5 justices nominated by a president of a single political party, that is, no more than 5 Republicans or Democrats at a time. And the second is the balanced bench, and this is the proposal that Mayor Buttigieg has endorsed. And you would start with 10 justices, 5 affiliated with the Democratic Party and 5 with the Republican Party. These 10 would select an additional 5 justices from the current circuit court judges, and the 10 partisan affiliated justices would have to select the additional 5 justices unanimously 2 years in advance for a 1-year term. Powerful, creative, not easy to get through Congress, obviously, to put it mildly. So is it fair to say that a convention might be the surest or most probable way of achieving these reforms? And what do you think of the idea of an Article 5 convention to achieve the reforms that you advocate?
Well, with respect to these reforms in particular, I think, to be clear, what we were trying to do is get out in front of a debate that's currently happening on the left, which is, hey, if we ever get both houses of Congress back, get rid of the filibuster, and let's just pack the courts. And that seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. It seems in the realm of possibility today. Now, it's a big if the Democrats are ever in a position to retake the Senate in the immediate future. There's a lot of anger about the way the Supreme Court has been really turned into kind of a political football, and how the court is really being treated as a partisan institution in a way that I think was less true a generation ago. And I think for many of the reasons that actually Larry talks about in his book, such as the increasing polarization of society, we're seeing that affect Supreme Court appointments, and we're seeing that affect the law. We now have 2 universes of law. We have, basically a Republican version of law and a Democratic version of law, and people just don't agree on basic fundamental precepts. We came up with these proposals because we think that they are, if you could get them through Congress, there are at least plausible, if somewhat adventurous arguments for why they are constitutional. I think if we were going to go to an Article 5 amendment process for the court, I'm not sure that these are necessarily the only proposals we should think about. I think there's a lot we need to think about there. And I'd love to hear what Larry thinks about this, because I think that the court, there's a lot of potential problems to talk about. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is the way in which the court is maybe reinforcing, being sort of a force multiplier for some of the problems Larry's drawing our attention towards. The court strikes down the Voting Rights Act. The court could have ended partisan gerrymandering last year. It chose not to. And there's ways in which the court is really making some of these problems worse. So I think if we're going to do that, we need to actually have a conversation about why do we have a Supreme Court? Is it just an extension of partisan politics? Because if that's the case, I don't see a good justification for the way the court is currently structured, where we basically have 9 people and they get to decide a bunch of really important stuff, and who those 9 people are is a little bit dependent on chance, because it depends on when particular octogenarians decide to die or retire. And I just don't think that's a sane way to run a country. I think that we need to have some kind of a conversation, I think this would be as good a place to start as any, about what the Supreme Court should look like, who should be on it, and what relationship should it have, and should its membership have to democratic politics. I'll say if you fix that, actually a lot of these other problems, we've talked about the way that the court actually plays a big role here. You lost U.S. term limits v. Thornton by 5-4. The court could have gone a different direction. That could have given you the outcome you wanted. Gerrymandering, the court could have stopped gerrymandering, and it's very easy to imagine an alternate universe in which the court did if Merrick Garland had become a Supreme Court justice.
So that is a very important suggestion, that the same polarization that has infected the country may, you argue, be afflicting the Supreme Court, and that in addition to the particular proposals you make, if there were a convention, you would want to think more broadly about the question of representation on the court. What I'm hearing in this very rich discussion friends, is a powerful concern that our current institutions, Congress, the courts, and the presidency, as well as the media, are not representing the considered and thoughtful and deliberate will of we the people. And that was really what the framers hoped would be reflected in the constitutional amendment process and filtered through representative democracy. And what I want to, your questions are phenomenal as always, and there's so many of them that I think I'm going to put a bunch of them on the table, first for Professor Lessig, and then direct some to our other panelists. But with that framework in mind, because our audience is curious about how to make our institutions more representative in the sense that you've described, let me just share with you a few of these. How can our system of government, has our system of government ever been representative? Speaking of representative democracy, why would many small states vote to amend the Constitution to reduce their influence? How do you keep a deliberative poll body from being infected with all the problems of Congress, which after all was supposed to be representative and deliberative, including money, partisanship, presuppositions, etc.? And then finally, Professor Lessig, what would you advise a fledgling democracy that was creating a constitution to do in order to ensure the representativeness that you hope for? So you heard those four, and you can bring them together.
So obviously, we have never had a representative democracy in the way that we think it should be representative, right? So the framers gave us a system where basically white men, property holders, were the people who had the political rights. And then Jackson damped down the property owning part, and then the 15th Amendment was supposed to enable African American men to participate, and the 19th Amendment made it so women could participate. So we've had an increasingly robust population who should be represented. And so I don't look to a golden past and say, let's go back there. I look to a golden ideal that I think is at the core of our Constitution and say, let's get there. Let's finally get there. Let's try a representative democracy for 10 years. Let's see if we could just have it and what would come from it. And if we could achieve the ideal through the principle of representative equality, I think many of the problems that we think confront our Congress right now would be easier to address. So it's not that the past is the example, it's that the ideal from the past is something that I think we should push forward on. As to the small states, you gave me a list of questions, imagining that I could remember them all. But as to the small states one, look, the Electoral College right now is often defended as an institution that benefits the small states. That's just not true. The swing states are not the small states. Pennsylvania is a swing state. Michigan is a swing state. Florida is a swing state. Those are not states. It happens that the population of Iowa and the population of New Hampshire, two swing states, are small, but that's completely accidental. It's just because of the purpleness of those states that they are important. So one of the most important cases ever to go to the Supreme Court to challenge the system that produces this swing state America was actually brought by Delaware. Delaware in 1968 brought a case to try to get the Supreme Court to end winner take all because they thought that it was benefiting not everybody equally, but benefiting certain states very powerfully. And I think that I actually think that there's an amendment that everybody should be okay with. There should be no partisan disagreement about this, or at least it should be a compromise we should all agree on, which would basically say, take the number of electors we have right now, so you give a certain advantage to small states. But instead of winner take all, allocate the electors proportionally at a fractional level. So it doesn't matter if you get a vote in Wyoming, it's worth as much to you as getting a vote in California or a vote in Texas. If you did that, the whole country would be in play. Every president would want to get a vote from everywhere. And so we would have a president who represented everybody, and I think that people, when they recognize that the problem with the college is that it's not representing America, would see this as an alternative that could better represent America.
And the one other question that I'd love your thoughts on is how would you prevent the citizen juries from being affected by the same partisanship as Congress?
Well, look, I think pathology of our Congress is driven in a huge way by the dependence that they have on raising money. It's because they have to spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money that they begin to be bent in a way that makes it hard for them to do the work of working together in a Congress. I mean, just think about yourself. If you spent 30 to 70% of your time raising money, and your fundraising staff told you, look, the easiest way to convince somebody to give money is to vilify the other side. If we don't throw out those Republicans, we don't get those Democrats out of office, we're never going to get what we need. The whole method of fundraising by vilification is the #1 most effective way to raise money. But the point is, if you do that for 3 or 4 hours every single day, how are you going to turn around and put your arm around somebody and say, let's work out a deal? Like, you've just spent all your time trashing the person in your little cubby where you have a headphone on calling people all across the country. Then you're going to walk on the floor of Congress and say, Joe, so wonderful to see you. Let's figure out how we can work on things together. I think we need to remove that pathological process from the core of deliberation. Like, the framers never imagined that the members of Congress were going to sit there on the telephone, obviously, calling people to raise money. That was just not in there anything that they were thinking about. And the point about the delivered poll, when you summon everybody, you draft everybody, and you've compensated them enough so that they're not troubled and losing their job or whatever, and you've put them in a room and you say, your job is to figure out what's in the right interest of America and work it out. And the reality is that the extremists will turn out to be 5% on each side, or maybe 10% on each side. And most people will not be those extremists. And they won't be worrying about raising money. They don't have to raise money. They don't have to make anybody happy. They don't have to worry that, if they do this, they're not going to get reelected, or they're not going to get, they're going to be punished in a certain way. Now, it's for that reason I don't think we should turn government over to bodies like this. I think accountability is important, and that's why I agree that the concern to make sure that terms can change is an important concern so that we have accountability. But I do think that there's a way to structure this so that the same pathologies that exist inside our Congress would not exist in a body like this.
Great, thanks so much for that. A question to Howie, and then last word to Dan. Howie, what would James Madison think about term limits?
I think he'd be in favor. Jefferson called term limits, he didn't call it term limits, he said mandatory, mandatory rotation in office. And here's a tidbit I learned today, and I've been involved in term all these years. There's no term limit on me. What I learned today is Ben Franklin, right here in Pennsylvania, in the first Pennsylvania Constitution, inserted a 4-year term limit on the Pennsylvania legislature. Now, there have been 5 constitutions altogether. They managed to get it out, but Ben Franklin favored term limits.
Fascinating, amazing. Dan, it's been a wide-ranging discussion. I know it's taken us beyond your particular proposals, but wearing your constitutional observer hat, if you said that if we had an Article 5 convention, you'd want to consider other proposals to reduce polarization and rethink the way we select Supreme Court justices. What might some of those be, and do you think that they might pass?
Well, I think there's 2 questions. I mean, there's one is who should be on the Supreme Court, and the other is what should the Supreme Court be doing, and how much power should the Supreme Court have, and should the Supreme Court be kind of exercising sort of a general veto over all sorts of legislation, which they do, because it turns out, and justices on both sides of the ideological divide are responsible for this. You can make a plausible constitutional argument that almost any form of legislation violates something in the Constitution. It doesn't have to be written down. It turns out that Shelby County, Voting Rights Act, that Section 4 was unconstitutional because of the principle of equal sovereignty, which isn't written down in the Constitution, but you get a bunch of smart folks together and they can come up together with some really good arguments. And so I do think we need to have a very serious conversation about whether we actually want a group of unelected people to have that kind of power, and whether there are any kind of constraints we can put on that power. I mean, right now, I think a big problem is a huge amount of our debate about the court and its membership is really a proxy battle about abortion. And because we know that it matters a lot. It matters a lot for a lot of other issues too. And we have to figure out, is that the right institution to be solving those problems? I'm not sure.
Thanks so much for that. I think, in fact, Larry, since this is your book in the beginning of what I know is going to be a very galvanizing tour, you should have the last word. So why don't you send our audience out into the fall evening with whatever words you want to give them about why it's urgently important to reform America so that we have a more representative system.
Well, the striking thing I was excited about to be on this panel is that there's obviously, we're all white men, but there's another kind of diversity that is on this panel of political diversity. And I think what you can hear out of this conversation is that though we have differences on substance, I think we've all come to a place where we see we need to have a really serious conversation about democratic form. And so I'd love to see an Article 5 convention that talks about term limits. I'd like to see that as part of a conversation about representational integrity. I think part of what you're saying is that we don't have a system for representing which is actually has an integrity with our populace because the insiders protect themselves from that. And I certainly agree that we need to think about the structure of the Supreme Court. There's so many other constitutional courts around the world that have begun to do it better than us. And for very simple reasons, we could imagine fixing our court in that way. But I think the most important lesson that comes from this is to resist a kind of elitism about the Constitution. And by that I mean, so I'm not going to name this, but you might be able to figure this out. I was having a conversation with a very senior liberal leader who's opposed to Article 5 convention. And I was pitching him about why some of his arguments were completely bogus, and anyway, this was a good thing that we should have. And he said, okay, you've kind of convinced me, but this conversation happened in October 2016. He said, why should we risk it? We're going to have an election. Hillary Clinton's going to be elected. She's going to pick 3 Supreme Court justices, and we'll get what we want through a reinterpretation by the Supreme Court. And it was like a punch in the gut, because I thought, this is what constitutionalism has become. It's above the people. It's like we should not involve the people keep the people far from the Constitution, because we can't trust you guys. Like we have to have the lawyers, the elite, who are figuring out what the Constitution should mean. And if there's any problems, then we'll just get another set of justices on the Supreme Court who will fix it for us. That is the death of democracy. When we no longer feel entitled and empowered and capable of even understanding our Constitution and doing something with it, then we don't deserve a Constitution. So you obviously, this congregation lives in the celebration of the idea that people can understand and celebrate and teach the Constitution, and I'm a great admirer of my friend Jeff and what you are doing. Thank you for that. But you are not America. And
you are America. You're the best of America, is what you're saying.
I'm happy to say that, but what I'm saying is most of America does not feel entitled or empowered or even asked to understand their Constitution. And until we can change that, which really is about changing the attitude of a bunch of elite people who think that they should be close to controlling the Constitution and keep it far from you, we are not going to have any hope of fixing the core problems that are at the core of democracy.
For inspiring all of us to live up to the best of America, please join me in thanking our panelists.